Welcome to Money Talks. I'm Genevieve Westcott with your inside oil on the economy here and abroad as it affects you in the ag sector. In this edition, is it time for Alan Bollard to gird his loins over at the Reserve Bank and step in to curb our rising Kiwi dollar to benefit all our exporters? The bank did it back in 2007. Is it time for a repeat performance? Global commodity prices have experienced the biggest boom in more than 100 years. In New Zealand, we hit record highs in March, led by strong increases for wool and dairy. And it's John Key and his government posse riding to the rescue yet again of another big company in financial trouble, this time AMI Insurance. Are taxpayers going to be happy? All this and much, much more coming up. But first, the latest rural economic report from ASB has its corporate finger on the pulse of our rural landscape. In a nutshell, the currency is rising, dairy prices are easing, lamb has gone from strength to strength, and U.S. beef prices are at an all-time high. Joining us now to tell us more is ASB rural economist James Shortall. And James, good to see you.
Yeah, always good to be here.
Now, you've been really out and about visiting those farmers around the country. What is the mood?
I think it's pretty good. I mean, I've been at some of the agricultural field days in Lincoln, down in Fielding at the Central District's field days, and talking to the farmers, they're feeling pretty good about life at the moment, and that's a big change over the past 12 months. And I think there's every reason for them to feel that way. Dairy prices are good, wool prices have had a remarkable recovery over the past 12 months, and meat prices are also looking good, so every reason to be feeling good. Okay,
so you have personally written this rural report for March. Tell us, what were the big stories now for the global markets?
Well, I think there's plenty of good stories. Dairy markets continue to look strong, and they have been strong really for 18 months now. But I think some of the biggest stories really come through in the meat industry, and particularly out of the US market for US beef. I mean, US beef prices are at all-time highs, and they're looking strong. I think that's going to continue for quite a while yet. But then you consider some of the in the sheep industry, prices of course are looking good. Wool prices are also looking really, really strong. So agricultural fronts looking good. On the global equity front, then there's been a bit of unsettlement, of course, with the Japanese earthquake and the Middle Eastern and the North African issues and the tensions around there with oil prices.
Not settling down at all. I see the rebels over in Libya continue to hold down the east, and Gaddafi is holed up in the west. That could go on for a very long time.
I think so, it could, and if it does, then the risk is that we're going to see higher oil prices, and what impact that's going to have on the global economy. I mean, that's the biggest issue, I think, right now.
Okay, and what else is going on for farmers? What did you notice in March that would be of particular interest to the boys and girls here at home?
Well, I think there's, of course, the interest rates. Interest rates from the Reserve Bank. There's been some decreases for the official cash rate, and I think that's going to be really important for farmers to keep a pretty close eye on what that impact's going to be for them, because short-term interest rates are looking good, and a lot of people, relative to the past few years, are enjoying short-term interest rates. They've taken the view that they should stay on short-term rates because they're very low at the moment, but and then they're going to look at fixing in down the track. The key thing that I would point out to farmers at home is that they need to be wary that if they're waiting for short-term rates to increase and then fix, then they may be too late.
They could miss the boat.
They could miss the boat, definitely, and because longer-term rates are already starting to rise a little bit, and you know, they're going to continue to rise over the next 12 months.
Apparently, commodity prices here, looking at my notes, may average around twice previous historic averages. How come?
Well, yeah, that's what I'm picking for dairy commodity prices. And right now, if we consider where prices have been historically, they're probably actually around 2.5 times the historical averages. And so what I'm sort of picking is that we've seen a structural change in the dynamics of the dairy industry around the world, and that's really been fueled by, you know, emerging economies, the Chinese buying more product. If you consider some of the consumption levels in those different countries, then China's currently consuming about 10 kilos per person per year in terms of fluid milk, and if you look across at Taiwan, which you consider to be, you know, similar dietary habits, that sort of thing, then they consume about 15. South Korea about 30. So you can see that there's big potential there for demand increases out of China, and I think that's really going to fuel demand for commodities, particularly in dairy, over the next sort of 10 to 20 years.
Fantastic. And speaking of China and pork consumption is huge. We'll talk to our next guest about that when he joins us. Stand by. Thanks. Coming up after the break, Spicer Senior Financial Advisor Jeff Matthews joins us to explore the insatiable world of Chinese pork consumption and what it means for soybean and grain markets around the world. New Zealand's agricultural export prices are likely to remain strong for some time. Great news for our economy. But what about that rising New Zealand dollar and the rise of the Aussie dollar? But first, answer this in our Farmers' Facts and Figures quiz. How much more is New Zealand exporting to China compared to 3 years ago before we signed that free trade deal? The answer when we come back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, how much more is New Zealand exporting to China compared to 3 years ago before we signed that free trade agreement? The answer, we've exported $5.2 billion worth of goods to China, 150% higher than our annual exports 3 years ago. And the Reserve Bank of New Zealand now says our agricultural export prices are likely to remain strong for some time, which is great for the economy, with demand underpinned by urban and wealth growth in developing countries, especially China. Joining us now is Jeff Matthews, Senior Financial Advisor with Spicers. Egg exports to boost the economy for some time, and they could stoke inflation, we're told. China still is a powerhouse, isn't it, Jeff?
It is. I mean, just last week, China announced that they were going to build 56 new airports in the next 5 years. I mean, $250 billion US. So the scale of what's going on over there, and I say we've seen it certainly in the ag sector, is staggering numbers. I mean, they're doing what other countries took 20, 30, 40 years to do in 5 years.
We'll come back to China, but let's first talk, everybody's talking, of course, about the New Zealand dollar. Is it too high? And I see Barclays, the big British bank, came out and said, listen, the Reserve Bank's got to get involved and punch it down. What do you think?
Well, I think there's no question that the New Zealand dollar is a bit too high at the moment. I mean, if you consider the weak New Zealand economy, all of those aspects, then, we are probably a bit too high at currently 78 cents. But I don't think it's a place for the Reserve Bank to necessarily get involved in the market just yet. Pure economics says we don't want any intervention. The market forces should dictate how things are going, and that's probably my core view at the moment.
Jeff, do you agree?
Oh, I do. I mean, even though the Reserve Bank has the power to intervene, it really lacks the firepower. I mean, if you're going to go in there and try and push the exchange rate down, you actually need, more than a handgun. You need a bazooka or a tank. I mean, and they just don't have that kind of firepower.
Now, interesting, Jeff, you sent me a fascinating article about China. It's doubled its meat consumption over the past 20 years. It's just growing and growing and growing, and they love pork, and that's creating some problems, of course, over in Iowa. Tell me about that.
Well, I mean, the problem is, even though China supplies half the world's pork, the pigs need something to eat, and soya is a major component in the kind of feed that they give them, and so China doesn't actually grow enough soya, so it's supplementing that by imports from Australia, from the States and from Brazil, and so they're concerned that they're becoming, again, dependent on outside sources for the feed for their products.
And the fascinating thing, James, is apparently they're building their livestock and their meat industry in 5 years, which, according to the article I saw from Bloomberg, took the U.S. 50 years.
Yeah, well, I think that it does come back to us here also. I've spoken to farmers over the past few months. Quite a few of them have actually, in the dairy industry in particular, have been saying that they've been taking the opportunity to sell heifers or calves into the Chinese market. Now, we're seeing them doing this in the pork industry. So they're obviously looking to expand their dairy herd in China, potentially by doing this over a long period of time. Then we're shooting ourselves in the foot, because they're going to gear up their own dairy industry to compete with us. We hold all the cards. They want our stock. So, this is not only happening in the pork industry, but also in the dairy industry, and it's something that we really need to consider.
Okay, from China, let's go to Portugal. You've been watching that very closely, Jeff.
Well, it's the third economy in the last year that's got into trouble that we know about. So a year ago, we were sitting here discussing Greece and what that might mean, and 6 months later it was Ireland, and finally it's Portugal. I mean, what happened recently, Portugal announced or revised numbers for their budget deficit for last year. So instead of being 7.5% of GDP, the economy, it was 8.6. So it exactly sent the same alarm bells that it did for Greece a year earlier. It's like, oh my God, you guys have been fiddling the books, and now you're finally telling us what the real numbers look like. And what happened is, in Europe, if you're investing in German bonds, 10-year bonds, the interest rate that you get on it, it's about 3%, whereas if you buy Portuguese bonds, they ballooned out to almost 9%. So there was a 5.5% difference for investing in bonds in the same kind of economic zone. What the market's saying is they think, you know, Portugal's in trouble and is going to default.
How's the U.S. looking?
The US is actually looking better. I mean, when I look at Wall Street, okay, it's off 100 points this morning, but it's held up reasonably well in the last month. When you think about, you know, the tsunami and what's happened in Japan, what's happened in Libya, oil prices at, you know, relatively higher levels, and you've had this kind of budget standoff in the US, you'd expect the US market to have come under some pressure. But if you're an investor in the States and you're getting 1/10 of 1%, you have to do things other than put money in the bank, and so the equity markets actually look undervalued at the moment.
Wow. And it's interesting. I see that the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, has put out a study saying that that as far as they're concerned, the world economy for 2011-12 looking not too bad. That kind of surprised me.
Yeah, well, I think it's two stages. You've got some countries that are doing exceptionally well, emerging Asia. That's why we've benefited so much here in New Zealand. But then you've got the other developed economies like the Europeans, like the US, like us, to be honest, that are struggling. And you know, so it is two stage, and we are getting some benefits from those from the emerging countries, and it's good that we're located pretty well geographically to those areas.
Let me ask you something too that intrigued me. Bill English, the finance minister, talking recently about how it's actually good that our wages are 30% less than Australia. That's going to make us a great place for people to come in and want to do business here. And he also says we're better here because although they're doing well with China in terms of the construction industry, we're actually better off here because we are broader based. We have all the food exports. What's your take on that, Jeff?
Well, I mean, it is a competitive advantage at the moment. I mean, the currency-wise, there's a huge difference. I mean, if it was a couple of years ago, we were 91, 92 cents. Now we're down at, what, 73, 74? That's a big advantage for, you know, small New Zealand manufacturing company. A
lot of unionists would say, though, that's a sign that our economy is struggling. We're making 30% less. James, what do you think?
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, there are some inherent issues. I mean, probably to come back to your point around the, you know, the scope of our economy, I do think that that's a competitive advantage for us over a long term. I would much prefer to be producing food than producing rocks, to be honest. And I mean, that's really where we are going, and we have more bases covered. The risk is that we do become a bit more concentrated on dairy, and that is going to be a risk. It's the same as what Australia becomes concentrated on mining. But you know, the talk around some of the wages and the low wages, yes, it is an advantage, but you know, I question whether it might be a little bit of election speak coming into the mix there a little too.
I'm sure both of you would like to be earning 30% more, correct?
Of course.
I think I would.
And I'd probably be spending 30% more, which would be great for the economy too. So
I'd be saving it.
Gentlemen, let's move on to AMI. Once more, the government appears to be getting ready to put its hands into taxpayers' pockets to help this company out. What's your understanding of where it's at, Jeff?
My understanding is that they're kind of backstopping as a kind of a guarantor that they can meet all their commitments.
Correct. They could stump up some money if it's needed. What do you think about that?
Markets are built on confidence, and so you know that's the same thing 2 years ago after the global financial crisis, that the government stepped in and put a kind of guarantee program behind the banks. Markets are built on confidence, and if you have a run on insurance companies or banks, you know, in a perfect world, yes, you don't like governments interfering, but sometimes they have to. I mean, there's no such thing as bad insurance. What there is are bad premiums, where people haven't priced the risk. And that may be the case with AMI. Correct,
and that's what many of the other insurance companies are saying.
Well, you'd expect them to say that.
Yeah, no, but that's what they're saying.
That's true.
That they sold cheaper options on insurance, and now it looks like we may have to come to the rescue. What do you think about that?
Well,
you're not off the hook, buddy. Give us your opinion.
I knew I wouldn't be off the hook. No, I agree with Jeff. I mean, I think it was crucial for the government really to step in and to provide confidence in the sector, because if there wasn't confidence, there would be some major issues. I mean, some of the media stuff I've been reading so far already started to see people move away from AMI, looking at other insurance providers, but I question why they would want to do that when the government's basically stepping in behind AMI. Probably if you consider going forward a little bit further, We've seen similar sorts of failures and issues in the finance company sector, other areas of the financial institutions around the world, and there's been a raft of new regulations. I think I wouldn't be surprised to see some changes in the insurance business going forward, and it means that consumers are going to pay more.
What I thought was interesting was Bill English acknowledging that there have been several companies that have gone to the government with their hands out looking for help. Is this going to become part of the Kiwi mentality? When we get into trouble, Big Brother's going to come and sort us out?
I hope not.
I hope not too.
Yeah, I hope not. And I think if that's the issue, then it's going to be a major issue, because the government doesn't have the money to do it. I mean, we continue to expect that the government's going to bail everyone out in these instances, and the government is really stretched at the moment. And looking at the government finances, then there's some significant issues that need to be addressed immediately in order to make sure that the government's going to be in a sustainable position going forward, and the economy's going to be in a sustainable position going forward. So they need to be resolved.
Well, otherwise we become the next Portugal.
That's right. That's right, and that's a very real possibility that we sort of shrug off a little bit. We've got credit rating agencies breathing down our neck, and then over a couple of months you start getting AMI, the Christchurch earthquake, all sorts of support from the government.
I mean, even if you look at the US and they're talking about they're going to chop $40 billion out of the budget. I mean, the deficit this year is $1.2 or $1.3 trillion. So $40 billion sounds like a big number, but in the scheme of the deficit, it's loose change. I mean, they're not tackling the serious issues about Medicare, Social Security, the military. Those are the big three-ticket items. If you look in New Zealand, pensions, welfare and Social Security are the big-ticket items. Nobody wants to talk about them, nobody wants to touch them. So
it's the elephant in the room,
absolutely.
And yet we're all faced with a $64 billion deficit. I mean, that is unbelievable for such a tiny country, isn't it?
Oh, it is, and we've seen over, I think it's going to have to be some pain at some point. Whether it's going to be this year, possibly could be, but there's going to be some election issues around that. If it's next year, then there's going to have to be some pain over the next couple of years, and there's no reason why we're not going to see people on the streets complaining about decreases in their welfare benefits, that sort of thing, which we have seen in other countries around the world.
The government's got to step up to the plate. Nobody's going to do it for you. They're the ones that are going to have to slash and burn now, and they seem to be playing for time, if you ask me.
There's no such thing as a free lunch. Somebody somewhere has to pay. And we're living beyond our means currently. And you do that in the recession. The government steps in with advancing infrastructure spend, broadband, those kind of things, bringing those costs forward to get the economy going. But after that, we need to unwind some of the entitlements that were brought in the previous 10-year period.
Well, I guess that means he's not buying us lunch, James, so it's over to you. Thanks, gentlemen. Coming up after the break, Future Proof, what our savvy analysts will be watching and assessing in the next 7 days. Get inside their brains and find out where they're headed. Saddle up. But first, here's your final Farmers Facts and Figures quiz for the show. On average, how many kilograms of grain and how many liters of water does it take to produce a single kilogram of meat? The answer when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, on average, how many kilograms of grain and how many liters of water does it take to produce a kilogram of meat? The answer, 3 kilograms of grain and as much as 16,000 liters of water are needed to produce that kilo of meat. And now it's time for Future Proof. What's coming up in the next 7 days that our experts will be watching? James, how about you?
Well, I think I'm going to be watching oil prices. They have been having an impact on equity markets over the past little while, and overall commodity prices. Of course, commodity prices have been really strong. And that has been driven by higher oil prices. It's been interesting actually over the past day or so that Goldman Sachs, large investment bank, research house, that sort of thing, they've come out and actually said that they're predicting oil prices to drop by about $20 a barrel over the next couple of months, and that's sort of completely against where the market is going at the moment. I think if we continue to see these tensions in the Middle East and North Africa, we could continue to see oil prices move up. So there's some issues around that, and I think the big issue is around the global economy and what impact it will have.
Yeah, but you know what? U.S. crude oil has hit a 30-month high now, and yet it seems as if we've reached a stalemate in Libya, certainly, with those airstrikes. Jeff, what's your take on it? What do you predict is going to happen over the next couple of months?
Who 2 months ago would have been talking about Libya? So, I mean, it could get resolved in 2 or 3 weeks' time, and so the pressure goes off the oil price. I mean, if oil stays up, if oil goes up to $120 a barrel and stays there for some time, that's going to have an impact on, especially U.S. consumers who are pretty, I mean, they're very twitchy.
They love their cars. They don't walk anywhere.
I know. And so, it's basically like another tax increase when you raise petrol prices. So anything that's lower is better. And I've seen a similar report to the Goldman one, which says the prices are actually going to come off. So.
Okay.
And you consider here in New Zealand we've got petrol at around $2.20 a litre or something along those lines, and we've got a currency at well over 78 cents. So well over 78 cents. So if we that's a bit of a buffer for us at $2.20 a litre. Then the currency only has to come back a little bit, which you'd argue that it's going to be good for the economy, but. Really that's going to mean high petrol prices. And
hey, speaking of oil prices, what do you guys think of the Greenpeace protesters and the others that are out there off the East Cape trying to stop the Brazilian ship that is, of course, surveying for oil and gas goodies under the seabed? What do you make of it?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I haven't been following the story very closely.
That is no excuse. What do you make of it?
I mean, I think we've got some resources here in New Zealand that we could be using. Then why not?
I just wonder, what is a message it sends to to the rest of the world about doing business here in New Zealand? Jeff, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it wouldn't matter if it was Petrobras or somebody else. I mean, they're just going to be anti it for the sake of being anti. So you don't want nuclear power, you don't want oil, you don't want this. I mean, so where are we going to get fuel to do all the various things and drive the cars to drive to the protest? I mean...
I think more than ever, New Zealand has to appear to be open for business. That's certainly what we're being told to do for the Rugby World Cup. I just think that it sends the wrong message.
Oh,
and I'm wondering why it's taking so long for the government to get tough and act.
Pass.
Anyways, enough of that. Japan, the tsunami. Let's talk about Japan, and let's talk about the nuclear situation. We now know that it's a 7 on the same scale as, let's say, Chernobyl. Serious stuff, and no end in sight to the problems there. James.
Yeah, and I think the issue really is around food and the security around that, and the perception in Japan of eating their own food. So they are a big importer of beef, of corn. It's interesting to note some of the facts around the dairy industry. They actually, we produce around 14 billion litres of milk. They actually produce around 8 or 9 billion litres of milk. So they're actually a big dairy producer, but some of that is going to be affected if they have to go into the international market. Then it could mean some changes in prices around the world. I think to date, then we haven't really seen that. But if this continues for a while and that perception really persists, then it could have some marginal impacts on prices.
I think too it's going to have some major impacts on the psyche of the Japanese people. For the first time in many articles I've read, you're seeing a kind of open anger. They're angry with TEPCO, the power company. They're angry with the government. It's sort of like we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore. This could have big implications too in the world economy, couldn't it, Jeff?
It could. I mean, and it could be a turning point for Japan, which has really been shifting sideways for the past 20 years. I mean, it peaked in kind of 1991, and it's been sliding ever since. So the fact is that consumers and the public are mad as hell, which is quite un-Japanese-like. Is how where do they go from here? That's going to be the cruncher. Because up until now, it's just been this kind of cozy relationship between the government and business.
Absolutely.
And, nod, nod, wink, wink, and, stuff goes away that shouldn't go away.
And it comes back to a little bit around the corporate responsibility and the question marks around that, and there certainly seems to be some major question marks around that responsibility and whether the execs have been taking the right measures in some of these cases. So, that needs to be resolved in order to have the confidence and to have the right perception going forward. And there's going to need to be some fairly sizable changes, as we've seen in other industries around the world in terms of finance and financial institutions around the world.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. Thanks to my guests, ASB rural economist James Shortall and senior financial advisor for Spicers, Jeff Matthews. We love to hear your feedback, so drop me a line on the website. Meantime, here's a tip. Never throw anything out. It could be worth big bucks someday. A 45-year-old pair of the Queen's underwear will soon be sold to the highest bidder by a British auction house. It seems Her Majesty left the royal bloomers on a plane during a trip to Chile in 1968. For more than 40 years, the garment was in the hands of a famed Miami playboy. Don't ask. When he died last year, his estate decided to sell the underwear, but the auctioneers have decided to prolong the sale until after Prince William and Kate Middleton tie the knot on April 29th. The auction house is relatively experienced in the sale of royal underwear. Seems they sold a pair of Queen Victoria's knickers for almost $12,000 3 years ago. Keep the faith and hold on to your pants, please. See you next time.